Well, hello then, I do hope you're all well. Now, will this shocking evidence leave you absolutely speechless? Well, what am I talking about? Well, during the Home Affairs Committee meeting on Channel Crossings, SNP MP Stuart McDonald wanted the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, David Neal, to explain what he had witnessed at Manston Detention Centre. And let's just say, it even left him speechless.
So, Stuart.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for coming back, Mr Neal. So you'll have heard, obviously, some of the concerns that have been passed to us, and some of which are in the public domain now as well. Have you had discussions with stakeholders? Have you had reports about, well, let's put it mildly, a deterioration in conditions at Manston, and a very significant one at that?
I have, and I attended Manston. I visited Manston on Monday, Chair.
And some of the stuff that we've been hearing about outbreaks of illness, about the place being significantly over capacity, about tension and outbreaks of violence, is that the sort of thing that has been fed back to you?
The reason for me going to visit on Monday was because we've been picking up lots of noise about Manston from a variety of sources. When I visited on Monday, I can perhaps add some clarity to what Dan O'Mahony had to say before. I can give you the data as was briefed to me on Monday. It was a visit, Chair. It wasn't an inspection. So these are just the figures given to me by the senior official who hosted us. When I was there on Monday, there were 2,800 detainees in Manston, 190 at Western Jetfoil. I didn't visit Western Jetfoil. And there were 24 en route between Western Jetfoil and Manston. The outflow figures, which I think is critical in terms of the size of the site, on that day, so on Monday, 1 had gone out of the facility. The previous 24 hours, 78 had gone out of the facility, and the average outflow was 137 out of the facility. The best outflow that they'd had in a day was 300. What was really concerning, what was alarming, was the numbers as have been described are clearly outstripping the capacity of the site. The facilities that you will have seen earlier in the year and the ones that I saw when I last visited in April saw mighty care and custody, so detainee custody officers supervising detainees close to where the fire station was, close to where the integration was. The capacity has now outstripped those detainee custody officers, so there is of the order of nearly 2,500 people who are being guarded by non-trained detainee custody officers. So they're being guarded by a mixture of immigration enforcement officers and security guards. It was sufficiently alarming when I discovered that. I was frankly speechless, and I'm not someone who is normally speechless. I immediately arranged to speak to a Magistrate Inspector of Prisons, which I did, and I wrote to the Home Secretary on Monday night to alert him, as it was then, to this situation.
Okay, thank you for that. That is obviously very alarming indeed. And I suppose in the last panel we sort of focused on physical capacity as opposed to sort of staffing ratios and so on, and that's clearly a hugely significant point. Did you get the impression that, do you have any idea how this situation has happened to arise? Because when we visited in June, as a short-term holding facility, it looked okay, not fantastic, but it looked set up to do the job. It's not as if the Home Office really kind of been taken by surprise by the numbers coming in. Did they explain to you what had been happening to try and alleviate the problems in terms of staffing, problems in terms of capacity? Was there an action plan of any sort available?
Like it was a visit rather than inspections. We haven't necessarily got that detail. I think it is as stark as they can't move the detainees on, so they are detainees, and therefore they're bunging up the site. I think there were proposals. I spoke to Lieutenant General Skeets, who the Home Office have brought in to examine this area, and there were proposals for making the site a mixed site in terms of non-detained accommodation as well as detained accommodation. And I think there were plans to install new types of units in order that the detainees could, well, they wouldn't be detainees then, they would be bailed, could be housed. I think, particularly in terms of the figures, particularly difficult. I spoke to 3 families when I was there, and I know the committee are interested in families who are in detention. I spoke to an Afghan family who had been in a marquee for 32 days. So that's in a marquee, probably the same ones that you saw earlier in the summer, with kit mats on the floor, with blankets, for 32 days. I spoke to an Iraqi family who'd been in hardened accommodations, who've been in buildings, and they've been there for 2 weeks, and a Syrian family who'd been there for 2 weeks as well, the mother of who was terribly distressed because she didn't know where they were going. So this is a pretty wretched conditions.
And have you also had it confirmed that there are outbreaks of diphtheria, and that there has been cases of scabies, for example, in the population as well? And have you been provided with any information about how the Home Office has attempted to deal with these issues?
I understand from Howard's brief that there have been 4 cases of diphtheria over the last 2 months, over a population that have passed through of 11,000. The medical facilities have improved since you were there, I suspect, certainly since I was there in April. And the doctor, for the first time, a full-time doctor on site, dedicated doctor, started work on Monday. And the first thing that he proposed was building a ward, or I think a 5-bed ward that I think they were going to propose to build as well. So in that sense, that was a positive. Sure. The medical facilities had improved.
So I agree that's a positive, but is it not overdue? One doctor has turned up on Monday. The horse has bolted, really. Is there not a sense in which some of this should have been in place ages ago? Again, just generally speaking, the numbers can't have surprised the Home Office. So, and I appreciate they have now issues with the outflow, but doesn't it speak to just a lack of planning and not responding until disaster has already struck?
It does. I wouldn't say disaster yet, but I would say that what we've seen is sort of creeping lack of ambition from the Home Office, moving from Tughaven as was, which was a jumble of tents on the side of the quay, through Western Jetfoil, that was capacity was soon outstripped, into Manston. You're right, the numbers, looking back when I was last there in April, the Home Office were predicting between 45 and 48,000, I think, coming in. The press was saying 65, but even on those numbers, there's always a need for greater capacity. And I think my view would be plan for the worst, hope for the best. And I think that attitude is absolutely critical if we're going to deal with the consequences of people being detained in a safe and humane manner.
You've spoken about the staff to detainee ratios and the types of training that the different staff have. Can I also ask you just about organisation and seniority? There have been some complaints, just reading in the press from staff working there, that it seems very bitty organisation. There are different government organisations involved, including MOD obviously, as well as Home Office. Is that a cause for concern that you had picked up upon? Are there sufficiently senior staff, and is there proper leadership on the site?
It's a point we made in the report that we did into small boats earlier in the year, and yes, it is a concern, because you need tight command and control if you're going to deal with a mass of people who are there. You need a dedicated commandant, so you need a senior responsible officer responsible for what goes on there. They've now got one, but they didn't have one in April. There was confusion. It was one of the questions I identified, that they needed to identify a commandant, and who is that commandant answering to, and who are they responsible to within the department. And I think that's absolutely key. And I think that leadership, to address the issue as is, not as the issue was hoped for, is an enormous problem for the Home Office. There's an operational issue going on the ground today that needs to be addressed by senior officials.
And finally, can I just ask you, what then will be your involvement in Manston going forward? Do you have plans for a re-inspection, or is that under consideration?
We have in our programme a Small Boats 2 inspection, so a second inspection that would cover this area, yet to determine whether we inspect before Christmas or after Christmas. with this being a short-term holding facility, the detention aspects will be covered by Charlie Taylor, His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons. We sent staff accompanying Charlie's team in July, because they reported on this in July, in advance of the numbers increasing for sure. But we've yet to determine when it is that we're going. But I've alerted Charlie to the latest concerns so that he can make a decision as to whether they return to inspect.
Thank you very much.
Can I just ask you the same question I asked the previous panel? The numbers in November last year were high. Excuse me. So we're at 2,800 as of Monday. If the numbers continue to rise and the outflow is considerably smaller than the numbers coming in, at what point does this cease to be a place that is safe and can be run properly?
I think we've passed that point.
Oh, we've passed that point already.
Okay. If there's nearly 2,500 people who aren't guarded by appropriately trained people, it's an extraordinary number. There's no prison in the country that's that big. Harmersworth Detention Centre capacity maybe 600 or 700. You need to have 2,500 people. That's a big issue.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely shocking, eh? Can you imagine what those people must be going through? Truly shocking. But what do you expect with this extreme Brexit Tory government, eh? But anyway, what do you guys think? I'll leave your comments down below, and until the next time, I shall bid you farewell and take care.